Hello guys, welcome back to the another video tutorial from TI Lectures. In this video lecture, we'll be discussing about the types of drugs. As I mentioned in the previous video tutorial, there I mentioned overview of the drugs and their effects on the mental health. Now, in today's lecture, we'll be discussing about the types of the drugs, right? So I have categorized here the types of drugs into two major groups. As you can see, the first one is the psychotropic drugs and the second one is psychedelic drugs, right? So we can say that there are two major types of drugs. One is psychotropic drugs and another is psychedelic drugs. First, as we know that a person who takes a drug for a non-medical use, for a non-prescribed use, is called as drug abuser, and the drugs are called as habituating drugs, or we may call them addictive drugs. You got my point? Now, the first we'll see the habituating drugs, or what we called as addictive drugs. We'll see the types of the habituating drugs or the types of the addictive drugs. There are two major types of the habituating drugs or two major types of the addictive drugs. The first one is psychotropic drugs. Got my point? Now, what are the psychotropic drugs? These drugs are called as sometimes mood alternating drugs. Why? Because they affect one's behavior, they affect the behavior of the individual, and they affect the mental activity of a person. These are further classified into four major groups. Psychotropic drugs, these are called as mood alternating drugs. These are called as mood alternating drugs. Why we call them mood alternating drugs? Because they affect the mental activity of an individual and they affect the behavior of an individual, right? We categorize further, we divide further psychotropic drugs into four major groups. First one is the tranquilizers. You can see here, the first one is the tranquilizers. What are tranquilizers? These drugs reduce tension. Tranquilizers reduce tension and they reduce anxiety and they produce a kind of a feeling of calmness. Got my point? Tranquilizer, it's a kind of a psychotropic drug. These drugs reduce tension, these reduce anxiety and produce a feeling of calmness. We'll cite here some kind of examples of the tranquilizers. The first one is chlorpromazine. First one is chlorpromazine, the second is risperidone, and the third is diazepam, and the fourth is alprazolam. There are different types of tranquilizers, but we'll cite some of the examples here. The first one is chlorpromazine. We can cite diazepam, right? So what are tranquilizers? These drugs reduce tension, they reduce anxiety and produce a kind of calmness, right? The second one is sedatives. What are sedatives? This is also a kind of psychotropic drugs. What are sedatives? These drugs reduce excitement and they lower physiological and functional activity of an individual. When they lower the functional activity of an individual, physiological activity of an individual, and then ultimately it leads to the drowsiness or sleep. So these drugs, sedatives, these are sometimes called as these include barbiturates, and we sometimes call them as sleeping pills because they are responsible for inducing sleep, right? So the continuous use, if we see the continuous use of sedatives, continuous intake of sedatives, it may cause the permanent damage to the brain, and their sudden withdrawal may cause epilepsy, right? The third one we'll see here are the opioids. This is also a kind of psychotropic drug. What are opioids? Opioids, these are the drugs which are derived from the opium. These drugs reduce pain and are called as analgesic or painkillers. Got my point? The drugs, the opioids, this is a kind of psychotropic drug, and these opioids are derived from the opium. These drugs relieve pain, they reduce pain, and are called as analgesic, or we may call them painkillers. I mentioned the word here, opium. I said that these opioids are derivatives of these opioids. These are drugs which are derived from the opium. Right? What is opium? Opium, or we may call it as afim. This is the kind of latex derived from the unripe fruits of the poppy plant. You got my point? Opium, or we may call it afim. This is derived from the unripe fruits of the poppy plant. Their long-term use and intake causes many health problems. You know, for example, their long-term use causes heavy weight loss, that reduces even fertility in men and interest in the work. There are many derivatives of opium. Like, if we see some, we'll cite some examples here. First, if we'll see, morphine is a derivative of opium. Right? Codeine is a derivative of opium. Similarly, heroin is a derivative of opium. The most important, the one, that's smack. This is also a derivative of opium. But how we get the smack? This smack is the crude byproduct of the heroin synthesis, and it is commonly called as brown sugar. This smack is commonly called as brown sugar. Right? How we get the smack? Smack is byproduct of the heroin synthesis. It's commonly called as brown sugar. Being cheap, it is considered as poor man's heroin. You got my point? The fourth one is stimulants. You got my point? The first one was tranquilizer, second one was sedative, third one was opioid, and now the fourth one is stimulants. As the name indicates, these drugs stimulate the nervous system of an individual, makes a person more active, makes a person more agile, makes a person more wakeful and active, and causes excitement. You got my point? We'll cite some examples, like if we know the caffeine that's obtained from the leaves of a tea plant, that's one of the stimulants. Right? Second one, that is cocaine, that's obtained from the coca plant, that's one of the stimulant. So we went through the psychotropic drugs. We said that psychotropic drugs are also called as mood alternating drugs. Why? Because they affect one's behavior and mental activity of an individual. There are different types of psychotropic drugs. One was the tranquilizer, and the second was sedative, third was opioids, which was derived from the opium. And there are different kinds of these opioids, like morphine is one of the derivative of opium, codeine, heroin, and smack. Smack is also called as brown sugar. How we get the smack? We get the smack by this is a byproduct of the heroin synthesis. Right? And this smack is called as poor man's, being a cheap, it's called as poor man's heroin. And the fourth one was the stimulant.